At 5:11 on a Saturday morning in June, the Port Detroit Diesel 671 started. I was inside the engine compartment of the Meridian when it happened, covered in grease, flashlight wedged between my chin and my shoulder, the specific smell of diesel and hot metal that I had been living inside for 7 hours. I listened to the port engine find its idle. I listened to the specific burbling note of a two-stroke diesel settling into itself after a start. The note that tells you whether what you did worked or whether it worked well enough or whether you're going back in with different tools. It worked.
Please hurry, we're running out of time.
I climbed out of the engine compartment hatch. The sky above Thunderbolt Marina in Savannah, Georgia, was the dark gray of an hour before first light. Not dawn yet, the suggestion of it. The sky deciding. Victoria Hale was on the aft deck of the Meridian where she had been for most of the night, in the specific composed stillness of a woman who has learned that hovering over people who are doing difficult work does not make the work happen faster. She came to the hatch and looked down at me. She said, "What did you use?" I held up the tape. She looked at it. Self-amalgamating marine tape. A roll of silicone tape about the size of a baseball. Gray, unremarkable, the kind of thing that sits in a marine mechanic's bag for months before being needed, and then is exactly what is needed. She said, "The regatta raises money for pediatric cardiac programs." I said, "I know." She said, "I know about your son." I did not say anything. She said, "The Hale Foundation funds the ablation trial at Savannah Children's Hospital. I can make a call Monday morning that puts Danny's application at the top of the review pile. The medical decision is Dr. Webb's and the committee's, but getting his case reviewed, that I can do." I looked at her from the dock beside the hatch. She said, "I should have made the call 4 months ago when Dr. Webb first mentioned his case to me. I hadn't connected the name. I'm sorry for that." She paused. "I'm making the call Monday morning regardless of tonight. Tonight changed the timeline, not the decision." I said, "The tape repair will hold for 6 hours under normal operating conditions. Keep the port engine below 1,800 revolutions per minute. Get a proper line replacement before she goes out again." I looked at the sky. The suggestion of light was becoming something more definite. I said, "The regatta is in less than 2 hours. I need to find my father." My father was on the dock. He had been on the dock all night, passing tools down through the hatch, and he had heard everything through the open hatch the same way he had heard everything his entire life, completely, without comment, at the right moment. He looked at me. He looked at the Meridian. He looked at the water, the pre-dawn dark of the Wilmington River, where it ran past Thunderbolt Marina, the harbor beyond it. He said, "She goes." 2 words. He poured coffee from his thermos into the spare cup he had brought, as he always brought a spare cup when he came to the dock, and handed it to me. We stood on the dock in the last of the dark and drank our coffee and listened to the port engine run. At 6:15 a.m., I walked to the parking lot and watched the Meridian clear the dock before I drove home. The port engine's note was steady across the water. The tape was holding. I grew up at Thunderbolt Marina, not approximately, literally. My father Joe had worked the waterfront for 35 years, starting at 19 as a deckhand on a shrimp boat and accumulating, over the decades that followed, the specific knowledge of the water and the engines that moved things on it that comes from being present on that water for a very long time. The marina was 4 blocks from the house I grew up in. I knew the sound of the Wilmington River before I knew much else. Joe had not formally taught me. He had worked, and I had watched, and eventually the watching had become working alongside, and eventually the working alongside had become being the one other mechanics called. This was how trade knowledge moved in families where the trade was taken seriously, not through instruction, but through proximity, the accumulated specificity of doing something until it was no longer learned but known. I had gotten my marine diesel certification at 22 from the Marine Mechanics Institute in Orlando, the formal credential that put a name on what I had been doing since I was 12. I had worked at Thunderbolt Marina for 16 years, the last 8 as senior marine diesel mechanic, which meant I was the person the marina called first when the problem was serious. I met Rebecca in 2009. We married in 2011. Danny was born in 2015. Rebecca died in May 2019 from aplastic anemia. a rare bone marrow disorder that destroyed her ability to produce blood cells, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Danny was 4 years old. I took 2 weeks. Then I came back because Danny needed me present, and the marina was where I knew how to be present. Completely, without the ability to be somewhere else in my mind, because a marine diesel engine does not permit distraction, and in the first year this requirement was one of the few things that helped. Danny grew up at the marina the way I had grown up at the marina. He had his mother's directness and my patience and a specific quality of attention to the world that the cardiac arrhythmia had not diminished and that I was fiercely protective of. The arrhythmia had been diagnosed at his 6-year checkup in 2021, a routine ECG that found something that should not have been there. Dr. Webb at Savannah Children's Hospital had been clear from the beginning. The condition was manageable and also progressive. The medication would continue to lose efficacy as Danny got older. The best available intervention for his specific arrhythmia type was catheter ablation, and the specific procedure that matched his condition most precisely was being studied in a clinical trial that the Hale Foundation funded. 12 slots in the trial. Danny was 23rd on the wait list. I had known about the Hale Foundation connection for 4 months, since February, when Dr. Webb had mentioned it in one of our quarterly consultations. I had not known what to do with knowing it. I was a marine mechanic from Thunderbolt. Victoria Hale ran a foundation that spent $30 million a year on pediatric programs. I had not found a way to bridge that distance. She had bridged it instead. Not by finding me, by her engine failing on a Friday afternoon the day before her foundation's most significant annual fundraiser, and the marina manager calling 2 mechanics who could not fix it and then calling me. I had been home with Danny when the call came at 9 p.m. Danny was already in bed. I'd called my neighbor, Mrs. Perez, who had a key and who understood what the work occasionally required. I'd called Joe. Then I'd driven to the marina. The Meridian was a 1962 Feadship, 78 feet of mahogany hull and teak decks, and the specific grace of a vessel built when built still meant something. Victoria had purchased her in 2009, spent 2 years having her restored by people who understood what restoration meant in the context of a 1962 Feadship, and had birthed her at Thunderbolt since the restoration was complete in 2011. Victoria Hale was 54 years old. She had founded the Hale Foundation in 2003 after the death of her son Charles from childhood leukemia. Charles had been 8 years old. The foundation had been built around a specific purpose, funding the pediatric medical research that might have saved him, and Victoria had spent 21 years making it one of the most effective pediatric medical foundations in the southeastern United States. She was not warm in the conventional sense. She was purposeful. Every conversation directed toward something, every resource deployed toward an end, the specific quality of someone who had decided after the worst thing happened that the only acceptable response was to make something from it. The regatta had been her idea 11 years ago. She was not a sailor. She had bought the Meridian because it was beautiful, and because Charles had loved boats, and because having a vessel that was magnificent on the water was her way of having something magnificent that was also partly his. The regatta had grown from a small harbor event to the Hale Foundation's most significant annual fundraiser, $3 million in a single morning from donors who came to see the Meridian lead the parade of boats. Without the Meridian, the regatta happened, but the morning changed. The port engine had developed its problem on Friday afternoon. Victoria's regular marine mechanic was unavailable, called to a vessel emergency in Beaufort. The marina manager had called 2 other mechanics. Both had assessed the port engine and recommended postponing the regatta. The fuel injection line repair required a parts order and 2 days of work. Victoria had said she needed another option. The marina manager had called me at 9 p.m. on Friday. I had worked on the Meridian twice before, routine service in 2021 and a raw water pump replacement on the starboard engine in 2023. I knew the engines. I knew the vessel's specific mechanical personality the way a mechanic knows any vessel he has been inside more than once. Victoria was on the aft deck when I came aboard at 9:45 p.m. She said, "Can you fix it?" I said, "I need to see it first." I went into the engine compartment. The twin Detroit Diesel 671 sat side by side in the main engine room. each one the size of a large chest freezer, each one a specific mechanical universe of two-stroke diesel engineering that I had been living inside since I was 12 years old. I started the starboard engine first to confirm its function. It ran cleanly, correctly, without hesitation. I shut it down. The port engine was the problem. I identified the cracked fuel injection line on the number 4 cylinder within 20 minutes. Not because the fault was easy to find, but because I knew where to look and had looked in the right order. The crack was in the high-pressure section of the line between the injection pump and the injector body. Fuel was spraying under pressure against the hot engine block. Not dramatically, not in a way the first two mechanics would have noticed if they had not been looking for it specifically, but enough to cause the misfire and enough to represent a fire risk under sustained operation. I climbed out of the engine compartment and told Victoria what I had found. She listened. She said, "And without a replacement line?" I said, "There's a field repair, self-amalgamating tape on the crack. It won't replace the line, but it will stop the fuel spray and allow the injector to function normally. It will hold for approximately 6 hours under normal operating conditions." She said, "The regatta is 4 hours." I said, "That's why I said approximately 6. She said, "Do it." I said, "Before I do, I won't sign off on this as a permanent repair. The line needs to be replaced before this vessel goes out again after today. You cannot push the port engine above 1,800 revolutions per minute. If those conditions are acceptable, I'll do the repair." She said, "Both conditions are acceptable. Do it." I went back in. Joe arrived at the dock at 10:30. He had his own tools in the canvas roll he had been carrying to marine jobs since before I was born. He positioned himself at the hatch without being told where to go, not because I had directed him, but because 30 years of working alongside someone compresses the directions into something closer to shared knowledge. He passed tools down as I needed them, sometimes before I asked. The preparation took most of the night, not the tape application. That was the final step, requiring precision and patience, but not hours. The preparation was what took hours. Cleaning the fuel line surface in the confines of an engine room by flashlight, removing every trace of fuel and oil residue from the section to be wrapped, because self-amalgamating tape bonds to itself and to clean silicone surfaces, but not to contaminated ones. Identifying the exact routing of the wrap around the crack and the adjacent fitting. Working out the correct application for the pressure this line would carry. I worked slowly. I worked correctly. Fast and wrong was worse than slow and right in every context I had ever worked in. And in a marine engine compartment at midnight it was a category of error that had consequences I was not willing to accept. Victoria stayed on the aft deck. She did not hover over the hatch. She did not come down to ask how long. She did not send anyone to ask on her behalf. She sat on the aft deck of her vessel in the warm Savannah night and waited, which was both the correct and the most useful thing she could do, and which not everyone understood. Sometime around 2 a.m., Joe said from the dock above me, "How's the boy?" I said, "Same." He said, "Dr. Webb call this week?" I said, "Thursday. Trial still at 22 ahead of him." Joe said nothing. Then he passed down the tool I was about to ask for. At 4:47 a.m. I said, "Tape." He had it ready. I want to tell you what the tape application actually is, because people who have not done it imagine it as simpler than it is, and the simplicity is not what made it work. Self-amalgamating silicone tape fuses to itself under tension. When you stretch it to approximately 1.5 times its resting length and wrap it over itself in overlapping layers, it bonds at the molecular level, creating a seal that is waterproof, pressure-resistant, and stable across the temperature range that a diesel fuel line experiences. There are no adhesives. The bond is the silicone fusing to itself. What made the application work was not the tape. The tape was the tool. What made it work was the surface preparation, the stretch ratio held consistently through each layer, the specific number of overlapping passes calculated for the pressure the number 4 cylinder injection line would carry at engine speed, and the additional passes over the fitting on either side of the crack that distributed the mechanical stress across a longer section of line. 12 layers, each wrap stretched to approximately 1.5 times its resting length. The specific hand pressure that my father's father had apparently discovered in the early 1970s on a shrimping vessel somewhere in Georgia Waters, and that had moved from his hands to my father's hands to mine without ever being written down. I worked in the confined space by flashlight, both hands inside the engine compartment, my back against the starboard engine block, the specific practiced patience of someone who has been doing this long enough that the body knows what to do and the mind can be quiet while it does it. When I finished, I ran my hand over the wrapped section once. Then I climbed out and said, "Crank it." Joe was at the ignition control panel on the dock. He had the access. The port engine turned. It caught on the second attempt. It ran rough for 30 seconds. The specific roughness of an engine re-establishing fuel delivery after a repair, the injector clearing, the cylinder finding its firing cycle. Then it smoothed. The note of a healthy Detroit diesel, 671 at idle, filled the marina. I stood on the dock and listened to it for a moment. Then Victoria was at the hatch and she was looking at the tape in my hand, and everything that came next came next. I went home at 6:15 a.m. Mrs. Perez was in the kitchen with coffee when I came in. She said Danny had slept through the whole night and was still asleep and that I should eat something. I told her she could go and thanked her. She left. I showered. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Danny came down at 8 in his anchor pajamas, the ones he had chosen himself last fall, the ones with small anchors printed on them in navy blue, which I had concluded were chosen partly because of the anchors and partly because 9 years of being around marine work had made anchors feel like the correct thing to have on your pajamas. He looked at me at the kitchen table. He said, "You were out all night." I said, "Yes." He said, "The boat?" I said, "The Meridian, Victoria Hale's yacht." He said, "Did you fix it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What was wrong?" I said, "Cracked fuel injection line on the port engine, number 4 cylinder." He said, "How did you fix it?" I said, "Tape." He looked at me with the expression he had developed over 9 years of hearing repair descriptions, the expression of a child assessing whether the answer was complete or whether there was more to know. He said, "What kind of tape?" I said, "Self-amalgamating marine tape. Silicone-based, self-fusing, rated for the pressure the line was carrying, 12 layers, each wrap stretched to about 1.5 times its resting length." He nodded. That was the complete answer. He got himself cereal and sat across from me at the kitchen table. After a while, he said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Is something else going on?" I looked at my son. 9 years old in his anchor pajamas, with his mother's directness and the specific quality of attention that 3 years of cardiac monitoring appointments had not diminished and that I was grateful for every day. I said, "Victoria Hale is going to make a call Monday morning about the trial." Danny was quiet. He said, "Dr. Webb's trial." I said, "Yes." He processed this. He looked at his cereal. Then he looked at me. He said, "Because you fixed the boat." I said, "She told me she was going to make the call regardless. Tonight moved the timeline." He said, "But you fixed the boat?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the June morning, the Saturday light on the Savannah streets, the particular quality of a summer morning in Georgia when the heat has arrived and has no intention of apologizing. He said, "Is it going to work? The trial?" I said, "We don't know yet. Dr. Webb reviews the case with the committee. The medical decision is theirs." He said, "But if they say yes?" I said, "If they say yes, we have the best available treatment for your specific arrhythmia type and a very good doctor doing it." He said, "That sounds like yes." I said, "It sounds like a very good chance." He ate his cereal. He looked out the window at the June morning. He said, "Can we go to the marina later? I want to see the Meridian come back." I said, "Yes." The Meridian came in at 12:30. Danny and I were on the dock when she cleared the river bend, the mahogany hull in the midday Savannah sun, the flags on her transom, the specific sight of a beautiful vessel that had been at sea for a morning, doing what she was built to do, and was now coming home. Victoria Hale was on the aft deck. She saw us on the dock. She came off the gangway and walked to where we were standing, and she looked at Danny in the way that I had noticed her not looking at him all morning, with the specific quality of attention of someone who knows something about a person and is meeting them for the first time and is managing the distance between what they know and what they are allowed to show. She said, "You must be Danny." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Your father fixed my boat last night." He said, "I know, with tape." Something moved across her face. Not the purposeful quality I had seen on her face in the engine compartment in the pre-dawn dark. Something older and simpler. The specific expression of a person who has been reminded of something they were not expecting to be reminded of. She said, "My son loved boats." Danny said, "What kind?" She said, "Any kind. All of them." Danny said, "Me too." They stood there for a moment, the Meridian settling into her berth behind them, the Wilmington River doing what rivers do in the afternoon. The June heat settled into the marina the way Georgia June heat settles into everything. Then Victoria looked at me. She said, "Monday morning." I said, "Thank you." She walked back to the Meridian. Joe arrived at the dock 15 minutes later with his thermos and the spare cup. He always brought the spare cup. He looked at me. He looked at Danny, who had turned back to the Meridian and was watching the crew tie her up, and was narrating the procedure to himself in the quiet, precise voice he used when he was observing something he found technically interesting. Joe looked at the river. He said, "How did she run?" I said, "Port engine stayed below 1,800 the whole time. Tape held." Joe said, "Good work." I said, "It was your father's application technique." Joe said, "He learned it from someone who learned it from someone. That's how it goes." Danny turned from the Meridian. He looked at his grandfather. He said, "Grandpa, can you teach me the tape thing?" Joe looked at Danny. He looked at me. He looked at the river. He said, "When you're old enough to be in an engine compartment without supervision." Danny said, "How old is that?" Joe said, "Older than 9. Danny said, "How much older?" Joe said, "We'll see." Danny appeared to consider this acceptable. He went back to watching the Meridian being tied up. Joe poured coffee from his thermos into the spare cup and handed it to me. He said, "Monday." I said, "Monday." We stood on the dock and watched the harbor and the river and the Meridian in her berth, and said nothing else because the harbor was there and the boat was in, and the tape had held through 4 hours of the Hale Foundation's regatta, and Monday was coming, and some things do not need to be said out loud to be completely understood by both people standing on a dock in the afternoon with coffee in a city where they have both known the water their entire lives. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life, a parent, a grandparent, someone who worked with their hands, who passed something down to you that they learned from someone, who learned it from someone else, a way of doing something that was never written down but never got lost? Those things travel further than the people who started them. What did someone pass to you that you're still using? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.